You know, I just had the sudden realization the other day that I've been doing this series for nearly 3 years. So before we get into anything, I wanted to thank you guys for the support. It's surreal to think it's already been that long since I did that Who's the Deadliest Assassin video. But now that we've done so many different categories for this series, I was trying to brainstorm what would be a fun idea for one of these videos, and I think identifying the series' most selfish assassin out of the protagonists would be a fun one to discuss. Single out those assassins that put their own needs and wants over the Brotherhood's. Now, a lot of assassins in this series have done this at least once at some point, but a good chunk of them did it repeatedly, and whether they meant to or not, their selfish actions inflicted harm upon the Creed. So let's deep dive into the selfish acts of each assassin in this series, and whether or not they deserve to be titled the most selfish assassin. And just in case you don't want anything spoiled from the games, I have the video in chapters so you can skip around based on each character. Altair is probably the perfect one to start with because he was an extremely selfish assassin at the start of Assassin's Creed 1, but he would eventually turn into one of the more selfless assassins of the entire series. But to start AC1, Altair broke every tenet of the Creed. He killed an innocent man, he got a fellow brother killed, among many others, in the invasion of Masyaf, and he nearly let Robert de Sable leave with the Apple of Eden because he was too egotistical and prideful to wait for a better opportunity to strike and attack from the shadows. Instead, he just announced himself and attacked head-on. Then of course, those actions are what led to Masyaf being invaded by the Templars to begin with. Altair was arrogant, egotistical, and very selfish. He often thought himself above the Creed, his brothers, and the tenets, but obviously this was an intentional character flaw he could develop and rise above throughout the entirety of AC1 and into where we see him step up and lead the Brotherhood in Revelations. It's pretty crazy to think that the once selfish, arrogant Altair from the beginning of the first game would end up devoting his life to the Creed and its beliefs, leading them into a new age and sacrificing nearly everything for the Brotherhood, including his family and his own life. If we were only judging Altair on who he was at the start of AC1, you could very well make the argument that he's the most selfish assassin, but we're basing this off of his entire life, and I'd say he more than redeemed himself of his wrongdoings later on. But what about everyone's favorite Italian, Ezio Auditore? In a sort of similar way to Altair, Ezio was driven by much more personal motivations like revenge in his younger years. But to be fair, it was quite a long time before he was officially inducted as an assassin and welcomed into the Brotherhood. For a long time, he was just a man with assassin training hunting his family's killer. But once he finally did become an assassin, he was able to put his vendetta aside and quickly rose up to become mentor of the assassins. Like Altair, he then dedicated nearly the rest of his life to the Brotherhood and always put it above himself. So while some may have considered his initial revenge quest selfish, which I really don't think it was, especially since he wasn't even aware of the assassin's existence yet, I still don't think there's anybody who would consider Ezio the series' most selfish assassin. To me, it's definitely not Connor either, who may just be the series' most selfless assassin. Connor sacrificed so much for the Brotherhood. He had to kill his own father and best friend. He abandoned his tribe, leaving the only life he had ever known behind. He continued to persist with his mission even when people betrayed him. There were so many times where Connor could have been selfish and put his own needs and desires above the Brotherhood's, but he repeatedly chose not to. He could have shifted his focus to hunting down George Washington once he learned he was the one who had his village burned, leading to his mother's death. But instead, he chose to continue pursuing Charles Lee and putting an end to the Templars. A lot of the other assassins in this series would have crumbled and given in to their selfish desires at some point, were they in Connor's shoes, but he stayed strong in his convictions. Connor is far from the most selfish assassin in the series. Aveline's sort of a difficult one to discuss because she's a bit more of an unorthodox assassin. Mentored by Agate, and she was never really part of a proper brotherhood. At least not how we knew it in some of the other games. But then again, I guess none of the colonial assassins really were. Aveline did still sacrifice quite a bit for the Creed and to stop the Templars though. She had to kill her own stepmother to defeat the Templars, and Agate didn't make for the best mentor, always doubting her and expecting her to betray the Creed. To be fair though, Aveline did disobey and do her own thing quite a bit as well. I wouldn't consider her the most selfish or most selfless assassin. She probably would fall somewhere in the middle for me. Edward, similar to Altair, is a tale of two parts. Throughout a majority of Black Flag, we see Edward make many selfish decisions, leaving his wife and unknowingly his daughter to try and get rich, helping the Templars, getting assassins killed, even killing a few himself, all for a payday. I mean, he was a pirate after all. Greed and selfishness is kind of what they're known for. But Edward's entire arc in Black Flag is him going from that selfish pirate to a selfless, mature assassin. Not to mention, we're talking about the most selfish assassin. And all these decisions Edward made were prior to him becoming an assassin. Edward learned to put the Creed and betterment of humanity above himself, leaving us with a very different man from the one who killed an assassin and tried to infiltrate the Templars just for some coin. Maybe some would still consider Edward the most selfish, but I definitely think there were others in this series who actively made more selfish decisions while they were a part of the Brotherhood. Adewale, however, is not one of those assassins. While we did still see Adewale kind of leave his duties as an assassin on hold to help the slaves in Freedom Cry, I view that far more as a selfless act than a selfish one. He wasn't afraid to stand up to injustice when necessary, and Adewale was still a very dedicated and loyal assassin all the way until Shay ended his life in Rogue. I mean, even Shay respected him. Adewale to me is certainly not the most selfish assassin. Now, with Arno, that's a bit of a different story. I believe Arno is one of the more selfish assassins in the series. And that's not meant to be a knock on Arno. I really like his character, but I think it's a clear flaw in him as an assassin. He too often let his emotion, his own personal wants and needs, take priority over the Brotherhood, and it leads to some very reckless and irrational decisions. A perfect example of this is with Elise. He invited a Templar into the Creed's underground headquarters and offered her the help and resources of the Brotherhood. He let his own personal vendetta and lust for revenge to find Delacaire's killer sway him into making some rash decisions, like letting Germain manipulate him into assassinating Lafreniere. On top of all that, he did so without permission from the Council and continued to disobey the Council and act on what he thought was best numerous times, which is of course what eventually led to him being exiled from the Brotherhood. To Arno, the Creed was more of a means to an end to get what he wanted. He was never really fully committed or dedicated, and it showed. Now, this did seem to eventually change in the Dead Kings DLC and beyond, as he grew as a person and decided to fight for more than just himself, but he certainly made a lot more selfish decisions than most assassins in this series, and has a compelling case for why he should be the most selfish assassin in Assassin's Creed. The Frye Twins, similar to Arno, did make some selfish decisions in Syndicate. Obviously, the biggest one is when they decided to disobey their direct orders from their superiors in the Brotherhood and essentially go rogue to try and liberate London. Now in the end, it may have been the right decision, but it was one they made for semi-selfish reasons, as they wanted to liberate London to honor their father, rather than it being what the Creed wanted and asked of them. Jacob makes quite a few reckless, selfish decisions on his own as well throughout Syndicate, often causing a mess for his sister to clean up when he could have been a bit more patient and rational. But that was never Jacob's style. I mean, only look at the damage he brought to London while working with Maxwell Roth. I attribute a lot of these rash and selfish decisions to Jacob and Evie still being very young and immature. I believe they're around 20 years old at the beginning of Syndicate, and you do see them become more mature and a bit more selfless in the Jack the Ripper DLC. I could see an argument for them being the most selfish assassins, but I do still think other characters were more selfish than them. Bayek is not one of those assassins though. While it's true that for a large majority of Origin's story, Bayek was driven by a personal motive for revenge, once he and Aya founded the Hidden Ones, he sacrificed practically everything he had left for the Creed, including his marriage. He was no longer driven by personal motives, and he became much better at keeping composure and control over his emotions, allowing him to be a more stoic, rational leader. Bayek to me is definitely one of the more selfless assassins of the series, and without his sacrifices and willingness to give it all for the Brotherhood, it wouldn't have survived for some of these assassins to join it in the first place. Now, our newest protagonist, Basim, is a very interesting one. The Basim we knew from AC Valhalla was very selfish. He effectively betrayed the Hidden Ones so he could get revenge on Odin's reincarnate Eivor. However, after playing Mirage, we know Basim wasn't always like this. Up until the ending of Mirage, Basim was a very loyal assassin who fought for injustice and often put the needs of the people above his own. But because he couldn't let the past go and wanted answers about himself, he went against what Roshan and the Brotherhood stood for. He defeated his master and chose to embrace Loki's personality. And of course, Loki was far more selfish than the Basim we knew and typically made himself the priority. Some people may say, well, Loki is the selfish one, not Basim, but it's not like Basim is possessed by Loki or anything. Basim is still Basim. He's just chosen to be more like Loki and embrace the mindset to prioritize looking out for himself and hunting down those who wronged him. Basim very quickly went from a selfless, loyal assassin standing up to corruption and injustice to a more self-centered, manipulative man who more so used the Hidden Ones rather than serving them, all while he could indulge in his personal quest for revenge on the other Norse reincarnates. While some may think Basim's actions were justified, in the eyes of the Creed, he made some very selfish decisions that ended up hurting the Brotherhood far more than helping it. So with all of that in mind, I believe the two most selfish assassins in the series comes down to Arno and Basim. Their journeys with the Brotherhood were almost the complete opposite. Arno joined to redeem himself and seek out a personal vendetta, where he was never really fully committed to the Creed, but eventually it seemed after Dead Kings he would be. Meanwhile, Basim started out with pure intentions in Mirage, but quickly became corrupted and put his own selfish needs and desires above those of the Brotherhood. Both, I believe, have strong cases for why they should be the most selfish assassin, but I think ultimately the most selfish assassin in this scenario is Basim. Arno definitely made a lot of selfish choices in Unity. He was disobedient, effectively caused Pierre Bayek to attempt a coup of the Creed by trying to have the assassins ally themselves with Elise and the Templars. Arno was even exiled for these choices, but he did eventually redeem himself, and I believe his intentions were a bit more noble than Basim's, even if they both wanted vengeance. Basim seemed a lot less apologetic about his betrayal, and we still don't really know his full intentions now that he's in the modern day. While I do believe Basim still cared about the Brotherhood after Mirage and during Valhalla, it clearly fell down his list of priorities, and he was far from that loyal, selfless assassin he was during most of Mirage. So that's why to me, Basim is the most selfish assassin, which is actually one of the reasons why I believe he's one of the most interesting and unique assassin protagonists of the series. He's far from the traditional hero we're accustomed to playing as. But anyways, that's of course my opinion. Let me know who you think is the most selfish assassin down in the comments, and what topic you'd like to see me do next for one of these videos. As always, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like, and considered subscribing to the channel if you're new. And other than that, thanks for watching, and have a great rest of your day, assassins.